The stench hit Detective Frank Guilleret like a physical blow. It was June 1895, and he was standing in the basement of a rented house at 16 St. Vincent Street in Toronto, Canada. For weeks, he'd been following a trail of lies and deception across multiple states and countries. Now 3 foot down in the damp earth, something white caught his eye. The deeper we dug, Guille would later write, the more horrible the odor became, and when we reached the depth of 3 foot, we discovered what appeared to be the bone of the forearm of a human being. But this wasn't just any human being. These were the remains of one 3-year-old Alice Pitezel and her 9-year-old sister, Nellie. 2 innocent children who had trusted the wrong man. 2 little girls who had asked repeatedly when they would see their mother again, never knowing they never would. The man who put them in this makeshift grave had seemed so normal, so trustworthy, so helpful. His real name was Herman Webster Mudgett, but the world knew him as H.H. Holmes. And as Detective Guilleret stood over those tiny bones, he realized he was looking at the work of America's first documented serial killer. The children had been suffocated in a trunk, their nude bodies buried in this cellar by a man they called Uncle Henry, a man their family had trusted completely. This discovery would unravel one of the most complex and horrifying criminal cases in American history, a case that would reveal how a mild-mannered businessman had systematically murdered at least 8 people, possibly dozens more. But Alice and Nellie Pitezel were just the end of Holmes's killing spree. To understand how it began, we need to go back to a small town in New Hampshire, where a boy named Herman was learning that cruelty could be hidden behind a smile. Herman Webster Mudgett entered the world on May 16th, 1861 in the quiet town of Gilmanton, New Hampshire. To neighbors, the Mudgett family appeared respectable. Levi Horton Mudgett worked as a farmer and house painter. His wife, Theodate Page Price, was a devout Methodist. They had 4 children, Ellen, Arthur, Herman, and young Henry. But behind the closed doors of the Mudgett home, something was wrong. Levi Mudgett was a heavy drinker with violent tendencies. He regularly beat his children with a cruelty that went far beyond typical 19th century discipline. Herman learned early that pain was just part of life, that violence was how problems got solved. At school, Herman faced a different kind of torment. He was brilliant, perhaps too brilliant for his own good. His academic abilities made him a target for his classmates, who resented his success and found creative ways to show it. One autumn day, when Herman was about 10 years old, his classmates decided to teach him a lesson he'd never forget. They dragged him to the local doctor's office, where a human skeleton hung for medical instruction. They forced Herman to stand face to face with death itself, making him touch the skull with his bare hands. They expected him to break down in terror. They expected tears, screams, maybe nightmares for weeks. Instead, something else happened entirely. Herman wasn't afraid, he was fascinated. Years later, he would describe this moment as a turning point. The skeleton that was meant to terrify him instead awakened something inside him, an obsession with death that would define the rest of his life. Herman began dissecting animals, studying their anatomy with the same intensity other children brought to games or books. He spent hours contemplating mortality, decay, the thin line between life and death. His parents, devout Methodists, were disturbed by their son's interests, but didn't know how to address them. In 1872nd rural New Hampshire, child psychology wasn't exactly a developed field. Herman excelled academically despite his unconventional interests. He graduated from Gilmanton Academy with honors at just 16 years old. His teachers saw a bright future ahead for the young man. They had no idea what kind of future Herman was actually planning. In 1879, Herman enrolled at the University of Vermont. He was restless there, unsatisfied with the pace and scope of his education. After just 1 year, he transferred to the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery. Ann Arbor, in the 1882nd, was a different world from rural New Hampshire. The medical school was progressive, modern, filled with opportunities for a young man with Herman's particular interests. He worked in the anatomy lab under Professor William James Herdman, the chief anatomy instructor. Officially, Herman's job was to assist with legitimate medical research and education. Unofficially, Herman discovered something much more profitable: Medical schools needed fresh cadavers for dissection and study. The supply was limited, and schools weren't too particular about where the bodies came from. Herman realized he could make excellent money by robbing graves and selling the corpses to medical institutions. But Herman's entrepreneurial spirit didn't stop there. He developed an even more elaborate scheme. He would create fake identities, take out life insurance policies on these fictional people, then use stolen corpses to fake their deaths. The insurance companies would pay out, and Herman would pocket the money. It was fraud on a sophisticated level, requiring careful planning, attention to detail, and a complete lack of moral boundaries. Herman excelled at all three. Despite his criminal activities, Herman managed to graduate from medical school in June 1884. His academic performance was mediocre, but he'd learned skills that would serve him well in his future career, though not in the way his professors intended. Years later, when investigators finally caught up with Herman, he would admit to running these insurance scams multiple times during his college years. He was already comfortable with death, deception, and treating human bodies as commodities. The stage was set for something much worse. In August 1886, Herman arrived in Chicago and made a decision that would echo through criminal history. He abandoned his birth name and became H. Holmes. The name change wasn't just about avoiding his past crimes, it was about transformation. Herman Mudgett was a small-town boy with limited prospects. H. Holmes could be anyone he wanted to be. Chicago in 1886 was a city of opportunity and anonymity. The population was exploding as people flocked there for work and a chance at prosperity. It was the perfect place for someone like Holmes to reinvent himself. He found work at a drugstore in the Englewood neighborhood on the corner of South Wallace Avenue and West 63rd Street. The owner, Elizabeth Holton, was impressed by Holmes's work ethic and professional demeanor. He was charming, intelligent, and seemed genuinely committed to building a successful business. Within months, Holmes had convinced Holton to sell him the store. She thought she was dealing with an ambitious young entrepreneur. She had no idea she'd just handed over her business to a predator. Remember Detective Guerriere finding those children's bones in Toronto? That discovery was still 9 years in the future. But the path that would lead to that basement began the moment Holmes took control of that drugstore. Across the street from his new pharmacy, Holmes purchased an empty lot. In 1887, he began construction on what he told investors would be a mixed-use building. Apartments on the second floor, retail space on the first. But Holmes had no intention of paying for this construction properly. He hired architects, contractors, and suppliers, then simply refused to pay their bills. When they threatened legal action, Holmes would delay, deflect, and charm his way out of immediate consequences. This became Holmes's standard operating procedure: use people's services, then discard them when the bills came due. The building that rose on that lot looked ordinary from the outside, 3 stories of unremarkable brick and mortar. But Holmes was designing something special on the inside. In 1892, as Chicago prepared to host the World's Columbian Exposition, Holmes added the 3rd floor. He told everyone it would be a hotel for World's Fair visitors. The timing seemed perfect. Millions of tourists would need places to stay. What Holmes was actually building was something far more calculated. The 3rd floor contained hidden rooms, but not for the elaborate torture chambers that newspapers would later describe. Holmes used these spaces to hide furniture and equipment he'd bought on credit, with no intention of paying for. But more importantly, Holmes was creating a space where people could disappear without anyone asking too many questions. A place where he had complete control over who came and went. A place where he could indulge the obsessions that had been growing since that day he touched a human skull in a doctor's office back in New Hampshire. Julia Smee was 31 years old when she became entangled in Holmes's web. She was married to Dr. Lawrence Connor, who had taken a job working at the jewelry counter in Holmes's pharmacy. The affair between Julia and Holmes developed gradually. Holmes was charming, attentive, successful. He offered Julia something her marriage apparently lacked. When Dr. Connor discovered the affair, he made a decision that would seal his wife and daughter's fate. He quit his job and left Chicago, abandoning Julia and their 5-year-old daughter, Pearl. Julia remained at Holmes's building, continuing their relationship. She thought she'd found security and love. She had no idea she'd found her executioner. On Christmas Eve, 1891, Julia and Pearl Both disappeared. Holmes told different stories to different people about what had happened. Julia had gone to visit a dying sister. Julia had fled to avoid her ex-husband. Each explanation seemed plausible on its own, but later Holmes would confess to a much darker truth. He claimed Julia had died during a botched abortion, a procedure that, despite his medical training, Holmes was unlikely to be qualified to perform safely. Mortality from such procedures was extremely high in the 1,892nd. Then, Holmes said he killed Pearl to cover up the circumstances of her mother's death. Julia and Pearl Connor were just the beginning. 3-year-old Emmeline Seagrand arrived in Chicago in May 1892, full of hope for her future. She was intelligent, capable, and professional. Holmes hired her as a secretary, ostensibly because of her connection to a doctor who sold a dubious vaccine for alcoholism. But Holmes's real interest in Emmeline was personal. For 6 months, Emmeline worked in the same building where Julia and Pearl had died. She walked the same halls, climbed the same stairs, worked for the same man who had murdered a mother and child just months earlier. Did she sense something was wrong? People who saw Emmeline in her final weeks noticed that she seemed to be losing interest in Holmes. Maybe she was starting to see through his charm. Maybe she was ready to move on to a different job, a different life. She never got the chance. In December 1892, Emmeline disappeared. Her parents were told she had eloped with a man named Robert Phelps and moved away to start a new life. It was a lie. After Holmes's arrest, investigators found Emmeline's skeleton at the home of a Chicago physician who admitted to preparing skeletal remains for H.H. Holmes. Her empty luggage was sent back to her mother in Indiana, a cruel final insult. Emmeline had figured out something about Holmes, something that made her pull away from him emotionally. That knowledge had cost her everything. But Julia, Pearl, and Emmeline weren't Holmes's only victims during this period. People around him were vanishing with disturbing regularity. Emily Van Tassel disappeared in 1891 after working at Holmes's drugstore. Her mother would later identify her as a possible victim when investigators began connecting the disappearances. Dr. Rustler had an office in Holmes's building. In 1892, he simply vanished. Holmes would later confess to killing him, though investigators could never verify the claim. Kitty Kelly worked as a stenographer for Holmes. She went missing in 1892, leaving no trace behind. The pattern was becoming clear to anyone who looked closely enough. People who got too close to Holmes, who worked too closely with him, who knew too much about his business practices, had a tendency to disappear. But in the 1,892nd, people moved frequently, communication was limited, and missing persons investigations were far less sophisticated than they are today. Holmes was operating in an environment where people could vanish without triggering immediate alarm. He was getting away with murder, literally. In early 1893, 4-year-old Minnie Williams moved to Chicago. She was a former actress seeking a fresh start in a new city. Holmes claimed he met her at an employment office, but he had actually encountered her years earlier in Boston while using the alias Harry Gordon. Holmes offered Minnie a job as his personal stenographer. She accepted, grateful for the opportunity and charmed by Holmes's professional demeanor. What Minnie didn't realize was that Holmes had been planning this encounter for years. He had researched her background thoroughly. He knew she owned valuable property in Fort Worth, Texas. Holmes began a careful campaign to gain control of Minnie's assets. He convinced her to transfer the deed to her Texas property to a man named Alexander Bond, another of Holmes's many aliases. In April 1893, Minnie signed over her property. Holmes served as the notary, a perfect example of his ability to manipulate legal and business systems for his own benefit. That same month, Holmes and Minnie began presenting themselves as husband and wife. They rented an apartment in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood. To outside observers, they seemed like a happy, successful couple. Then Minnie's 8-year-old sister, Anna, came to visit. The sisters trusted Holmes completely. They called him Brother Harry. They believed he was saving them from financial hardship and helping them build better lives. On the 5th of July, 1893, Anna wrote what would be her final letter to her aunt back home. Brother Harry says, "You need never trouble any more about me, financially or otherwise. He and sister will see to me. I hope our hard days are over." She was planning to travel to Europe with Holmes and Minnie. She was excited about her future. Neither Anna nor Minnie were ever seen alive again. For years afterward, Holmes would use Minnie's name in various scams and business dealings, signing documents and rental agreements, as if she was still alive and working as his partner. The Williams sisters had trusted the wrong brother, Harry. By 1893, Holmes had refined his methods considerably. He wasn't killing randomly or in fits of rage. He was operating with cold calculation, selecting victims who could benefit him financially or who posed risks to his various criminal enterprises. John Davis traveled from Greenville, Pennsylvania, to visit the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. He never returned home. In 1920, he was declared legally dead. Harry Walker came from Greensburg, Indiana, in November 1893. He had written to friends that he was working for Holmes in Chicago. He had even taken out a $20,000 life insurance policy, naming Holmes as a beneficiary. Walker was never seen again. George Thomas made the fatal mistake of going into business with Holmes. In 1894, Holmes and his partner Benjamin Pitzel took Thomas to a Mississippi swamp along the Tombigbee River. Holmes would later confess to his second wife that they killed Thomas there and disposed of his body. Milford Cole received a telegram from Holmes in July 1894, asking him to come to Chicago from Baltimore. Cole disappeared after making that trip. Each disappearance followed a similar pattern. Holmes would identify someone with money, property, or knowledge that could be useful to him. He would gain their trust through charm and apparent business success. Then, when they were most vulnerable, they would simply vanish. Holmes was becoming increasingly bold, increasingly confident that he could operate with impunity. That confidence would ultimately lead to his downfall. Benjamin Freelon Pitzel was 38 years old when he met Holmes in 1892. A carpenter with a criminal past, Pitzel was exhibiting a coal bin invention in the same Chicago building where Holmes worked. The two men became close friends and business partners. Pitzel helped Holmes with various scams and schemes, believing they were simply clever ways to make money in a competitive business environment. A prosecutor would later describe Pitzel as Holmes's tool, his creature. But Pitzel saw Holmes as a friend, perhaps the closest friend he'd ever had. That friendship would destroy not just Pitzel's life, but the lives of his children. By 1894, Holmes's various criminal activities were catching up with him. Insurance companies were investigating him for arson. Creditors were demanding payment. Law enforcement was beginning to take notice of the pattern of disappearances around him. Holmes needed money, and he needed to disappear from Chicago. He came up with what he thought was the perfect plan. He would convince Pitzel to fake his own death so that Pitzel's wife could collect on a $10,000 life insurance policy. They would split the money and both start new lives elsewhere. The plan called for Pitzel to set himself up as an inventor named B.F. Perry in Philadelphia. Then he would stage a laboratory explosion that would kill and disfigure him. Holmes would provide a cadaver to play the role of Pitzel's corpse. Pitzel trusted Holmes completely. He believed his friend was helping him provide for his family while escaping their mutual legal troubles. He had no idea that Holmes had already decided the plan would work better with a real corpse. On the 4th of September, 1894, Holmes murdered his closest friend. He knocked Pitzel unconscious with chloroform, then set his body on fire with benzene. Later, forensic evidence would show that Holmes administered additional chloroform after Pitzel was already dead, probably to stage a suicide in case he was charged with murder. Holmes collected the insurance money based on Pitzel's real corpse, then told Pitzel's wife, Carrie, that her husband was still alive and hiding in London to avoid legal troubles. Carrie believed him. Why wouldn't she? Holmes had been her husband's business partner and friend. He seemed genuinely concerned about the family's welfare. Holmes convinced Carrie to let him take custody of 3 of her 5 children, 1 3-year-old Alice, 9-year-old Nellie, and 7-year-old Howard. He told her the children would be safer with him while she dealt with the legal complications of her husband's fake death. Remember Detective Gayere digging in that Toronto basement? Those were Alice and Nellie's bones, he found, but their murder was still weeks away. First, Holmes would take those children on a journey across multiple states and countries, all while keeping them separated from their mother by only a few miles. It was psychological torture disguised as protection. Holmes began an elaborate cross-country trip with the three Pizzle children. They traveled through the northeastern United States and into Canada. At the same time, Holmes escorted their mother, Carrie, along a parallel route, keeping the family members separated while maintaining the fiction that Benjamin Pitzel was alive and in hiding. The children kept asking when they would see their mother again. Holmes kept making excuses, promising reunions that would never come. In Detroit, just before crossing into Canada, the children and their mother were separated by only a few blocks. They were so close they could have walked to each other in minutes. They never knew. Alice, the oldest at 13, was beginning to suspect something was wrong. She wrote letters to friends back home, letters that Holmes intercepted and kept as souvenirs. In these letters, Alice expressed confusion about why they couldn't see their mother, why their father remained hidden, why their journey seemed to have no clear destination. 9-year-old Nellie and 7-year-old Howard were younger, more trusting. They believed Uncle Henry was taking care of them, just as he'd promised their mother. On the 25th of October, 1894 in Toronto, Holmes murdered Alice and Nellie. He forced the two girls into a large trunk and locked them inside. Then he drilled a hole in the lid and attached a hose connected to a gas line. The girls died of asphyxiation. Holmes buried their nude bodies in the cellar of his rental house at 16 St. Vincent Street, the same basement where Detective Guerriere would find them months later. But Holmes still had 7-year-old Howard in his custody. Holmes took Howard Pizzle to Indianapolis, where he rented a house in the Irvington neighborhood. On the 10th of October, 1894, he visited a local pharmacy to purchase drugs. He also stopped at a repair shop to sharpen some knives. Holmes killed Howard with the drugs, then dismembered the boy's small body and burned it. Later, investigators would find Howard's teeth and bone fragments in the house's chimney. 3 children who had trusted Holmes completely. 3 children whose only crime was having a father who believed in the wrong person. With Howard's murder, Holmes's killing spree finally came to an end, but not because he had developed a conscience or grown tired of killing. He was about to be caught. Holmes was arrested in Boston on the 17th of November, 1894. He had been tracked there by the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, which had been hired by insurance companies suspicious of the Pittees' death claim. Holmes was initially held on an outstanding warrant for horse theft in Texas. It seemed like a minor charge, hardly worthy of such an extensive manhunt, but investigators were beginning to piece together a much larger pattern. The insurance fraud was just the beginning. There were questions about missing people, suspicious deaths, and a building in Chicago that seemed to be connected to multiple disappearances. Detective Frank Guerriere was assigned to find the 3 missing PZLE children. Their mother, Carrie, had been asking about them for months, and Holmes's explanations were becoming increasingly implausible. Guerriere began tracing Holmes's movements, following his trails city by city, hotel by hotel. He was methodical and persistent, exactly the kind of investigator Holmes had been able to avoid for so long in Toronto. Following leads from Holmes's travel records and witness statements, Guerriere arrived at 16 St. Vincent Street. The smell from the basement was unmistakable, with Detective Guerriere uncovering the bones of Alice and Nellie Pitzel, realizing he was looking at evidence of crimes far worse than insurance fraud. Following his conviction for Benjamin Pitts' murder, Holmes confessed to 27 killings across Chicago, Indianapolis, and Toronto. The Hearst newspapers paid him $7,500 for his confession, a significant sum in 1895, but Holmes was still playing games, even from death row. Of the 27 murders Holmes confessed to, only 8 have been confirmed by investigators, with one other considered probable. Many of his supposed victims were later found to be alive and well. Some had never existed at all. Holmes confessed to killing Dr. Robert Leoch in 1886 for insurance money, but Leo actually died of natural causes in 1889 in Ontario, Canada. He claimed to have murdered a man named Rogers from Morgantown, West Virginia, in 1888. Rogers was later found alive. Kate Durkee of Omaha was supposedly killed in Holmes's Chicago building in 1892. She also turned up very much alive. L. Warner, owner of a glass factory Holmes had purchased, was allegedly burned alive in a basement kiln. Warner, too, was found to be living normally years later. Why was Holmes claiming credit for murders he didn't commit? Even facing execution, he couldn't resist manipulating people's perceptions of him. By inflating his victim count, Holmes was ensuring his place in criminal history, even if that reputation was built partly on lies. But mixed in with the fabrications were genuine confessions to real murders. Holmes admitted to suffocating victims with chloroform and other gases. He described trapping people in airless spaces and burning others alive. He claimed to have used starvation as a method of execution. He confessed to killing Julia and Pearl Connor on Christmas Eve 1891, to murdering Emmeline Cigrand in 1892, to ending the lives of Minnie and Anna Williams in 1893. The truth was buried somewhere in Holmes's web of lies, and investigators are still sorting fact from fiction today. On May 7, 1896, Holmes was hanged at Moymenning Prison in Philadelphia for the murder of Benjamin Pettersell. Until the moment of his death, Holmes remained calm and pleasant, showing no signs of fear, remorse, or anxiety. He chatted amiably with his guards and showed interest in the mechanics of his own execution, but Holmes did make one final request that revealed his deepest fear. He asked for his coffin to be encased in concrete and buried 10 foot deep. He was terrified that grave robbers would steal his body and use it for medical dissection. The irony was perfect. Holmes, who had spent years trafficking in stolen corpses, was afraid of becoming one himself. The execution didn't go smoothly. Holmes's neck didn't break cleanly during the hanging. Instead, he strangled slowly, his body twitching for over 15 minutes before he was finally pronounced dead. His body was buried in an unmarked grave at Holy Cross Cemetery in Pennsylvania, sealed in concrete, just as he had requested. Holmes's crimes had a profound impact on American society's understanding of criminal behavior. He was the first case that demonstrated how serial killers could hide behind facades of respectability and success. The sensational newspaper coverage of his case established many of the tropes we still associate with serial killer stories today. The murder castle, the charming villain, the elaborate death traps. Much of this coverage was exaggerated or completely false, but it captured the public imagination in ways that factual reporting never could. Law enforcement agencies began developing new methods for tracking criminals across state lines and sharing information about suspicious patterns of behavior. The Holmes case showed how easily dangerous individuals could exploit the gaps between different jurisdictions. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of people seeking new opportunities in America's rapidly growing cities. Holmes' victims were often people who had left their families and support networks behind, making them perfect targets for predators who understood how to exploit trust and isolation. In 2017, Holmes's body was exhumed for DNA testing amid persistent rumors that he had somehow escaped execution. Due to his concrete-encased coffin, his remains were remarkably well preserved. His clothes were almost perfectly intact, and his distinctive mustache was still visible. The body was positively identified through dental records. H. Holmes was really dead, just as he had been for over a century. Holmes's story reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is the one who seems the most helpful, the most trustworthy, the most normal. If this case fascinated you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We explore America's most chilling criminal cases every day, diving deep into the psychology and investigation techniques that help us understand how these crimes happened and how they were solved. Drop a comment below and let me know what aspect of Holmes's crimes do you find most disturbing. His ability to gain victims' trust, his calculated planning, or simply how normal he appeared to everyone around him. Thanks for watching, and remember, the scariest monsters are often the ones who don't look like monsters.